Good morning. We want to welcome you to New Covenant Grace Fellowship in hot Citrus County, Florida for yesterday, April 29th, and I saw someone put on Facebook that it was 101 degrees. I know Friday night, coming to the Great Chili Cook-Off, in our car it said 100 degrees. Well, that's pretty warm for April, even for Florida. But anyway, we're glad you all are with us, and we trust that you're going to enjoy the rest of the service such as we are today. I want to make mention of Mark Drake's ministry last week. How many enjoyed Mark's ministry last week? How many would like us to kidnap him and not let him get out of here with just one service next time he's around? No? We need to hear a whole lot more. Hey, guess what, too? I pinned Mark down. We went out to lunch, and I pinned him down, and he said, I asked him, I said, would you please prayerfully consider writing the foreword to my new book that I'm working on? He didn't even hesitate. He said, I'll be honored to do that. So, Jenny, Mark's going to be able to write the foreword to the book. And the title of the book is When God Doesn't Heal, Avoiding Fear, Shame, and Condemnation. Amen? And all the stories that people have been writing and sending me, boy, we need that book. We need to hear that book. And so, anyway, Mark has gone through some things as well, and he shared with you, but he'll be an excellent one to write the foreword. But several of the things that Mark said really spoke to me. You know how when someone ministers, there seems to be one or two things that really stick out that you don't forget. 99 to 9/10% of my message today, you'll probably forget by the time you get to your vehicle on the way home. But there might be just something I say that will ring true and will stick with you. And pray that I can get it all out, okay, and that you all can understand. As I've said many times, if you have a hard time understanding what I'm saying, just please raise your hand and I will repeat myself. I'm not offended by that, okay? I want you to understand. I want you to get what we're talking about. But a couple of the things that Mark talked about really hit me hard. And one of the things, it wasn't even really in his message per se, but it was while he was introducing and talking about his books that he had available. By the way, the books have not arrived yet. They probably should come next week sometime for those of you that did order books from him. But the first book that he wrote was God's Brilliant Plan. And you know, if you remember right, back in the early days when we first started coming into the concepts of New Covenant Grace, we used that book as a study guide to help people with. Like my book that's back there, The River is Here, My Journey into New Covenant Grace, that book and Mark's book, God's Brilliant Plan, are kind of primer type books that if someone is looking to get into grace and kind of wants to understand like what our church is all about, what's this grace thing all about that you guys always talk about, then those would be good books to get some basics into you and help you understand that. But as Mark was talking about God's brilliant plan, and I never knew this before he mentioned it last Sunday morning, but the primary reason that he wrote that is he felt that through his travels and through his getting around the nation and the world, that many, you talk about grace, and many don't understand what grace really is. And I fully agree with that. As I say this in my book, and I've said that here and many other places, as I've ministered around the country teaching this. But you ask most Christians, anybody that's been in the church for any length of time at all, that has any basic Bible knowledge and understanding, you ask them, does your church preach grace? Oh, by all means. Every church preaches grace, at least in their own thinking they do. And if you ask them, what is the definition of grace? Like parrots, all right? Quinn and I used to raise parrots. At one time, we had over 50 of them in our home that we raised, we sold, we breeded them, different things, okay? We had our own parrot, Avery, our own raising business. A parrot, like an African gray or a Congo African gray or some of the big parrots, they talk. And they have the mental capacity of a 5 to 7-year-old child. They can talk, they can talk, they can talk. But in the most part, now, there is some modern research that they've said and documented that some parrots actually can understand what they're saying. But for the most part, a parrot only speaks that and repeats that which has been spoken to them. In other words, it's regurgitation. It's taking in and parroting out the same thing they took in. So if we were to ask most Christians today what their definition of grace would be, like a parrot, they would speak back to you what? It is God's unmerited favor. Well, you see, that is not the understanding of what grace really is. It is a part. It is only a small part. But as you ask them, do you understand that grace really is the power of God working in you? Remember Mark talking about Christ in you is the hope of glory, Colossians 1:27. That grace is really the power of God. Christ himself indwelling the heart of the believer, making them righteous and holy. They look at you like you came from Mars. They do not understand it. And Mark said part of the problem is that we do not have good definitions established within the church. And I agree with that. And that's what we're going to be talking about. The title of today's message is The Definitions of New Covenant Grace Fellowship, Part 1. In other words, and this is only going to be an introductory message today, more next Sunday, if the Lord wills. But it's pretty much what makes us different than everybody else. What makes us different. And we have to understand that Angie said something interesting Wednesday night. We were talking about this. We had a good discussion going on Wednesday night. By the way, Wednesday nights, we don't have a big turnout, but they've been really great meetings, you know. And we talk about this stuff and we discuss it. We learn more. But Angie brought up a good point. She said, you know, I'd like to talk to my friends, and I noticed you posted and you put on Facebook this morning, you shared my grace nugget of the day. Every day, I put a grace nugget of the day on Facebook. And I've been doing this for about a month now, and I'm going to continue to do it because I don't think I'll ever run out of material on that. But today's grace nugget, by the way, was how do you know if you are in a grace church? Now, this is a part of the definition of our congregation, okay? And that's why I'm sharing this with you. And I shared it on Facebook this morning. How do you know? It says, it's only like a 1 or 2 sentence thing, okay? It's not a real long thing. I don't put any scriptures with it. I can back everything I put on there with more than one scripture, but I don't put it on there for a reason, because I want people to dig it out themselves. If they're really curious, and they might ask me, well, where'd you get that? I might give them a hint, but I want them to learn it. I want them to dig it out themselves, okay? And then they'll accept it. But the grace nugget of the day today was, how do you know if you are in a grace church? Good question, huh? Good question. Well, here's the answer. I couldn't help but thinking Chris was singing about focus today. And I thought, wow, this really fits in. To answer that question, how do you know if you're in a grace church, is the focus on what God has done, or is it on what you must do? is a focus on what God has done or on what you must do. Now, as you understand that a little bit, then that means you have a little bit of an understanding of what grace is. By the way, I only have a little understanding of what grace is. Don't ever think you've arrived. If you think you've got all the answers on grace, the first thing I want you to understand is that you're deceived. Because grace is an ongoing revelation, and grace can only come as a revelation from the Holy Spirit. You will never learn grace in the conventional sense of the word. Now, that does not mean that we don't teach. It goes right back to Angie's question. I feel inadequate to share with my people on Facebook and other places what New Covenant grace is. I feel inadequate. Our job here, this is why we're here this morning, not just to worship God, not to have fellowship, but to also learn more so that we do come to the place of adequacy. You know? And like I said to her, and I'll say to you too, if you are ever sharing grace with someone, and you know what? And I know some people, listen to me, I know some of you will never share some of these things on your Facebook at all that I put down. And I can encourage you to do that. I'm trying to stop encouraging because I know a lot of you won't. Because some of you are deathly afraid to do that because you're afraid that someone's going to get angry with you. You don't want to lose a friend. I can hear a pin drop. I know I'm right. But you know what? Guess what? You're doing your friends a great disservice, especially if they're locked up and living a life of fear, shame, and condemnation because they're trying to follow some law. You'd be better off telling them the truth, and they hate you as an enemy for the rest of their life, and maybe something that you said to them someday will shock them thinking, I remember Andy said that. I remember David said this. And all of a sudden, man, I thank God for what they said, what they spoke into my life. Maybe that will never happen, but you'll never go wrong sharing the truth. Now, my job, Corinne's job is to use us if necessary. If you find yourself sharing grace and someone's just not getting it, or someone's just resisting you, and you see you're not, you come into a place where you do feel inadequate, call us up, send us a text, get us involved. I have actually been invited to go to dinner with people, from people in our church to talk about this. I've been invited to go out and have coffee with people and share with them about grace, to have lunch with people, just go over to someone's house and they served a meal and invited Queen and I. They invited people in and they said, you know, we're going to invite our pastors because we want them to talk to you. Would you listen? Would you come? And we were invited to, you know what? We love doing things like that. Anytime you can get me involved in sharing grace, you know, just don't hesitate. Now, I may not be able to drop everything right at the time and do it right instantaneously. Maybe I can, but don't ever hesitate getting me involved, right, Ann? And if I see, because I like the fact that she shared that grace night of the day, and I see she's getting some problems and running into, I'll jump in and try to bail her out if I can. I've also found this out, that some people just don't want to hear it. And they will refuse to hear it no matter what you tell them. But you know what, saints, it's a numbers game. We have to keep being ambassadors for the Lord Jesus Christ. Keep sharing, talking to them about these things. That was the other thing that Mark said the other day, I believe. That was good advice to our church. Remember, I asked him, what advice could you give our church? I gave him those questions 2 minutes after he walked in the door. We did the interview 10 minutes after he got in. So he didn't have a chance to think about a lot of things. So it was spontaneous, what he was sharing back with me. But and I believe this was really the Lord. I believe it was a prophetic thing that the Lord used him in. He encouraged us. He said, what advice would you give a small church like ours? Remember what his answer was? It's one person at a time. Reaching out one person at a time. And he's so correct. You know, we can go and try to reach out to the masses, but what really builds a church, and when I'm talking about building a church, I want you to understand, I'm not into this thing for numbers. I'm so far beyond that, I don't care. When I was young in the ministry, came fresh out of Bible college years and years and years ago, that was a big thing. You know, you go to a preacher's convention, and you'd meet a preacher for the first time, and another fellow pastor shaking his head, and the first thing would come out of his mouth, how many of you running in church? Almost instant. And you know what? If you said you got 30 or 40 or 50 people, you felt like you didn't arrive, you know. Well, we're meeting with a handful of people in our garage, you know. I got 2 couples I'm meeting with. Did you hear what Mark said? What preaching the gospel really is? Not what I do, but it's what you all do every time you open your mouth and talk about grace. Come on. It's emphatic, energetic talking about the things of God. I'm sorry to spit on you, brother. That's what true grace is all about. All right? I'll back up here a little bit. That miracle saliva that I'm not supposed to have, I got a whole mouthful of it when I talk. Unfortunately, when I sleep at night, I'm as dry as a desert. But anyway, thank God. But that's what this is all about. And I want you to understand that. I want you to understand what makes us who we are and what we're doing. And I know we go over it and go over it and go over it. But yet, you know, we have to, because as long as people come to me and say things like Ange did the other day, we're going to keep going over it. Because we have to. We have to. We have to understand what these definitions are, why we're different than anybody else. Yesterday, in yesterday's Citrus County Chronicle, our friend Nancy Kennedy, she writes a column every Saturday in the religion section of the paper called Grace Notes. Nancy has a pretty good grasp on grace, not totally, like the rest of us, she's growing in it. But every once in a while, she really hits a home run. And she sure did yesterday, because it went right along with what I was feeling in my heart. I'm going to ask Quinta to read that. She went on Facebook, and I'm one of her Facebook friends, so I saw it when she put this out. But she went on Facebook, and she asked this question of her friends. She said, how best can you define your church? I thought, boy, this could be interesting. I'd like to get all those answers, you know. But she printed a few, and you know what? Unfortunately, some of them weren't too exciting. In the column, she also quotes from a lady who wrote a book on people who are getting hurt in the churches. And then she went on with some of the responses to this. So I'm going to ask, I'm not read the whole column, but highlighted just a few paragraphs there. Honey, if you go ahead and read those, go ahead now.
How would you describe your church experience? Is it a safe place, or is it something else? Kate Young Kaylee grew up loving a little church in...
This is the gal who wrote the book.
...in Moultonboro, New Hampshire. But when she was only 5, her father became ill, and her mother took a job as a waitress where she was required to serve wine and beer, which violated the church's covenant. Instead of helping them, their congregation voted to kick the family out of the church. As a result, they were shunned in the community. Kaylee writes about this in The House Where the Hardest Things Happened. The family never went to another church after that, but Kaylee says she never stopped loving Jesus. She writes about meeting Bob, the transmission man, who tells her about his friend's sister who had gone religious. As Bob's friend, hooked on drugs and booze and lost in trouble, slowly died, the sister didn't even offer to help. She just kept reading her Bible. What kind of religion is that? He asked Kaylee. As I sat down to write this, I asked my Facebook friends, what are some words or phrases that describe your church experience, past or present? Some used words like sanctuary, spiritual, tranquil, and comfortable, inspired, challenged, loved, full of life, energy, and hope. One person said, betrayed, used, manipulated by church leaders, but humbled, grateful, encouraged by my fellow congregants. Another wrote about being betrayed by petty church politics. She said, when the attacks become personal and vindictive, she left and found another church. However, she said, she's afraid to get deeply involved, afraid of being hurt again. At its worst, church is hell right here on earth, said one person. But at its best, it's family, friends, and fellowship.
See, that's an unfortunate situation. When I read that, it grieves my heart. You know, the problem is that you and I have, especially if we're talking to church people, and, you know, we should be also talking about people who've never stepped foot inside of a church in their entire lives. But if we're ever talking to church people, the problem that we have, and they don't want to come, I mean, I guarantee you, when we came to church this morning, we drove through some of the golf courses in Citrus Hills, and they're getting full already this morning. There's probably many people out playing golf this morning or on the lake fishing this morning who love God with all their heart. They really do. They would consider themselves, if you would ask them, they would consider themselves a Christian, but they don't want a thing to do with church. And the reason is because something happened. And if you'd ask them, and you'd say, well, you know what, how about you come visit our church Sunday morning? Most of them might say, oh yeah, I'll do that someday. And you know, just by what's coming out of their mouth, you'll never see them. But the problem is that everybody thinks, for instance, that, and hear me, I'm trying to say this in the right way, okay? They think that we are no different than the Baptist church down the street, no different than the Assemblies of God church down around the corner, no different than the Presbyterian church down yonder, or the other Pentecostal church or the Charismatic church, that we're all the same. And I want you to understand that because of what we believe in, because of who we believe in, and what he has done for us, we are not the same. We are not the same. And I know that's a hard pill for some people to swallow, and some people think, who in the world do you think you are? You think you are the only one that has all the right answers. And on and on and on that thinking could go. But it's all I have to do is to, and I do this a lot, it's all I have to do is to take someone like my sister Jackie here, and I can point my finger to this lovely lady who I'm so happy is not sick. Amen. She gave us a scare the other morning. I chewed her out for not telling me about it, but I found out about it through the grapevine. But Joe found out about it first, and he said, what's wrong with Jackie? I said, I don't know, I haven't heard a thing. But anyway, I can point to this gal because, you see, when Queen and I first came to Citrus County, and we'd been 12 years living full-time in that motorhome, and we had our RV parked in the RV park. Clyde and Jackie lived in one of the permanent units that were there. And so shortly after we got there, we began to have a Sunday night Bible study type thing there at the clubhouse. These guys faithfully came every Sunday evening, and we got to meet them. And then when we took the church full time and everything, they jumped right in and they followed us right into the grace teaching. See, I know Jackie, and I know some of the things of the Jackie, 7 years ago or so? Huh? 7? 5, I think? I know some of the things that she was going through then. This gal has been transformed, like most of us have, by the teachings of New Covenant grace that's found in this church. Would you say amen?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I'm like Paul saying, I don't have to sound my own horn. I don't have to tell people about my great accomplishments. It's all I have to do is point to people like this. Actually, I can point to every one of you. Amen? Because you have changed. You have been transformed by people, by the power of God dwelling within them. Y'all understand what I'm talking about? So I can say we're different. Because when we first met, our message was just typical. Revival, revival, you know. God's one day going to do something for you. Hang in there, you know. It was like a message that people are hearing all over the place today. But then one day, God began to show us that Christ in us is indeed the hope of glory. And things began to change as we began to get the revelations of New Covenant grace. It's how we define it. It's what makes our church different. I'm not going to keep you much longer because Joe keeps saying you got to start preaching shorter. And Matthew does too because it's easier for him to render the video. He likes it when I go short. Next week I'm going to get into a few point-by-point definitions of some of the things that make us stand out. But today, I have a copy of our mission and vision statement that was revised in January 15, 2015. There are some partial copies of that back there on the table next to Angie about what is our church. But this will give you just a little bit of an idea of who we are and what we stand for. Let me just read through this real quickly. It's just a few paragraphs. Our mission and vision. As believers in God through Jesus Christ, we understand that we as Christians live in the confines of New Covenant grace that God has provided for mankind through the finished works of the cross of Christ. We understand that we no longer live under the law of Moses, or for that matter, and this is even more important than the law of Moses, any law that man conceives that by following will make God pleased with us. I want to draw your attention to that for a minute. When Paul wrote the epistles, all right, when Paul wrote all of his epistles, then someone asked me one time, well, are you a Pauline preacher? I said, yeah, I am, because when I first started coming into this thing, I remember God speaking to me just as clear as a bell. Make sure you preach the gospel that Paul preached, right? And some people don't understand that Paul received the message of grace prior to Peter and James and the rest of the apostles. That's why it's important. For instance, the book of Peter, or book of James, for example, is written to the 12 tribes. Is that you? Not me either. You see? And James, even though James is an important New Testament book, James, the book of James, was the first book of the Bible, the New Testament written. And James did not hear the message of New Covenant grace until about 7 years later when Paul came back from Arabia and came to Jerusalem and shared the gospel of grace with the brethren at the First Jerusalem Council. That's all in the book of Acts and the book of Galatians chapter 1. Acts 15 and Galatians chapter 1. You can read the guideline, or the timeline, rather, of Paul's life. He lays it all out, point by point by point, in Galatians chapter 1. Most people never read that, nor do they understand it. And if you ask people, Are you still living under the law? Oh, yes, by all means, we have to live by the law. All right? Many Christians have been taught that, wrongly so, because all of that was fulfilled. And I'll ask people, say, just read 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul talks about the old way that brought death and condemnation. Now, how many want to live in death and condemnation? You're going to live in death and condemnation if you follow the old way, which he talks about, came down from the mountain on stones, written on tablets of stone. What is that? An integral part of the law, the Ten Commandments, which bring to death and condemnation, was replaced. Was replaced. What does that mean? Was replaced. If we replace this chair for next Sunday, don't come to church next Sunday expect to sit in this chair, because it won't be here. I sometimes think that some Christians are the dumbest thing alive on the face of the earth, because they don't understand simple English. If something was past tense, how many teachers were standing? You teachers, Chris, if something was replaced, does it exist anymore? It was replaced by the new, which brings life. So I go, that's how I've lost all this. I keep, I don't get it. You people are driving me stinking nuts. What? Now tell them, go into 2 Corinthians 3. Read it for yourself. Well, but what about, what did Paul, I've actually had people say, well, Jesus is more important than Paul. It's amazing. How did Paul get in the Bible then? You know? All of his books. He wrote 3/4 of the New Testament. How did he get in the Bible?
The latest I've heard about the Ten Commandments is good morals to go by.
A good morals to go by. All right? So Shannon said that she heard that the Ten Commandments are good morals to go by. Well, let's go back to what Paul said. If they lead to death, is that a good moral to go by? Law always will lead to, here, I'm talking about this a lot in my new book too. Remember this, law will always lead to death. Why? Because you can't follow it. And remember this, remember this, remember this. 3 things always follow law: fear, shame, and condemnation. Always. And that's where 3/4 of the church people today live. They don't understand it. So, but I also want to mention this about law. That is that law, all right? But what about all the other laws that we come up with ourselves that we think if by following them, I'm going to be a better Christian and God is going to love me more? Come on. God, because I'm going to follow. Remember, I talk about this in my first book there, and I mentioned it in the second book that I'm writing now. The greatest lie that I ever taught before I saw all this stuff. I used to teach and preach a lie for years and years and years. The lie is being propagated all over the world today. Here's the lie. The more you do for God, the more God is going to be pleased with you and do for you. So if you're not having your prayers answered, like in my new book, if you're dealing with sickness and disease, people say, well, I just don't have enough faith to be healed, or I'm not obedient enough. I just finished chapter 7 of my book, and in that, I'm dealing, Jenny's got to do some proofreading on it now, but in that, I talk about Deuteronomy chapter 28. The great key word, if. If you do this, and if you do that, you'll be blessed. If you don't do this, and you do the other thing, you will be cursed. How many know under the new covenant there are no curses? All the curses died at the cross. Someone comes to you, some preacher tells you you're going to be cursed. Tell him he's a liar. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I know that's really hard, but you're face them right in the eye. That's religion speaking to you. You will never, never, never be cursed of God. It's impossible for God to curse any one of you, no matter what you would ever do or don't do. You may operate and live under a work and action of the flesh that might get you into trouble and a consequence, but don't blame God for it. It's your own dumb fault. Come on. I want you to understand this, saints. And I want you to get a hold of this because it's so important. This stuff is basic. So all these other laws that we come up with in our own making, these laws of our own making that that create within us a feeling of ourselves that by following them, God's going to be pleased with me. See, the reason why many people don't feel like they're getting healed, the title of that chapter is Help. I don't have enough faith to be healed. Where does that thought come from? Because God has given to everyone a measure of faith. All right? And so it's not so much, it's dealing with these different, and here's where you talk to someone about that stuff, and it's all because of some of the things that they have gone through and trying to live that moral life, that good enough life, and consequently they can't measure up. So it's dealing with that. Law is done. We understand that we no longer live under the law of Moses, or for that matter, any law that man conceives, that following will make God pleased with us. Therefore, we deem it necessary to continue learning more of God's plan for us and for all of mankind. We understand that God has provided for us an easy and light life that can only come as we enter into his rest. And can you hold it for just a few minutes while I'm on a roll here? Okay, I'll get to you. We're under the easy and light life. That's a subtitle of Mark Drake's book, God's Brilliant Plan. Living the easy and light life that God provided. Understanding that. And most of us Christians work. If I could only do this, if I do that better, I had an argument with my wife, so I must not be a good Christian. Or what are you shaking your head yes for? All these things, all these little things that come between your two ears and make you feel like you're a second-class Christian. I'm sick, so God's angry with me. How come I can't get healed? How come I can't get healed? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? Personally, what's wrong with me? How come I had to have surgery? How come I had to go through the whole thing that I had to go through? How come I got part of my leg now in my mouth? What's that all about? How come I can't talk right? Maybe I might not talk right for the rest of my life. What's wrong with me? She had cancer, and she was perfectly healed. She was sovereignly, divinely healed of cancer. But not me. I had to go. I want you to know something. I was healed just as miraculously as she was. The healing that took place, and you know what? God never puts sickness or disease on you either. God will never make you sick to try to teach you a lesson. And you know what? The devil didn't make you sick either. Come on. Why do people have cancer? Well, look at the junk we eat. Look at the GMO and all this kind of stuff that... I proclaim to you, I have been miraculously, supernaturally healed. And you know what? God put some divine, special angels in my life called doctors and nurses to help me along on that route too. But praise God, he healed me. And some of the things that I have received as a result are far greater than if I say definitions. I talk about this in that chapter. My definition of my miracle would have been to spit that tumor out under the ground. That was my definition. But how many know God's definition was far greater than just that? And I can't tell you the good that has come into my life as a result of my dealing with cancer. Now, he took those lemons in my life and he transformed them into lemonade. But he wants to do the same for you too if you only let him. Begin to think right. You know what? If you're living under that condemnation cloud, that fear, shame, and condemnation, that is a greater sickness than anything you would physically ever go through, because that will always open the door for more.